Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's a little different today. We're doing a nighttime, so I'm glad everybody came out at night to see us. So my name is Carol Stern, and I'm a librarian at the Glen Cove Public Library here in New York. Before we begin, I just have two announcements. The next author that we're getting is Brendan Slocum. He wrote The Violin Conspiracy. He'll Zoom with us Tuesday, February 28th at 2 p.m. That's Tuesday, February 28th at 2 p.m. I'll send out an email in a day or two and you can sign up. If you enjoyed this event and other events that we have here, we would appreciate if you would consider joining the Friends of the Glen Cove Public Library. You can do this through our website, www.glencovepubliclibrary.org. We rely on community support to make these events possible. So thank you in advance if you plan on joining. So hi, Thrity. Say it again.
Thrity.
Thrity. It's an honor to have you here today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol.
Thrity is the best-selling author of 8 novels, including The Space Between Us, which was a finalist for the Pen Beyond Margins Award, as well as a memoir and 3 picture books. Her books have been translated into several languages and published in more than 15 countries. She is a distinguished professor of English at Case Western Reserve University, a recipient of the Nieman Fellowship to Harvard, and she's contributed to the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and Huntington Post. So you're one of my favorite authors. It is such a joy to read all your books. They're really, truly amazing. Your work gives me a multifaceted view into different cultures and different worlds. I think Honor is a powerful, important, unforgettable book. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of this talk. And again, we're going to mute everyone during the discussion, and after we can unmute ourselves. So you went to business school. You're also a prize-winning reporter. How did you and when did you decide to become a writer?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, by the way, going to business school was sort of one of the most, I refuse to refer to any stage or any phase of my life as a mistake. But, you know, there are many, I went to business school because that's what my parents wanted me to do. I was a liberal arts kid, you know, I think from the day I was born, but, you know, it was a giant detour. And again, I don't regret it because it taught me something about myself. You know, the fact that I could survive 5 years of business school and come out relatively sane was a good thing to know about myself. But, you know, I came to this country to get a master's in journalism, kind of righted the track of my life. My undergrad in India was in business, and then I knew that that was not the life for me. And so I came to Ohio State to get a master's in journalism, and I practiced that for many years. And then sometime in the mid-1990s, I started getting bored with just doing one thing. So I decided to go back to school and earn a PhD in English. And once I started doing that, something rather strange happened, which was, you know, most of the time, I mean, the PhD in English is a research degree. So you're being trained to be a critic, you know, and to be a scholar and to sort of dissect, if you will, other people's work. What would happen in my case was every single time I read, you know, a book that I loved, it made me want to rush to my desk and write my own work. And somehow, while working full-time as a reporter, while going to school part-time to earn a PhD to do my coursework, I also started writing a novel. And, you know, at some point, the predictable happened, which was I crashed. I mean, there was no way to juggle all this at the same time. So I put the novel aside and completed the dissertation. And a couple of years went by, and, you know, the unfinished manuscript kept nagging at me every once in a while, like, do something. So what I did in the year 2000 was I applied for something known as the Nieman Fellowship to Harvard, which is basically a fellowship for mid-career journalists. And it allows you a full year of study at Harvard. You can take whatever classes you want and whatever areas you want. And it's a great deal. But I applied for two reasons. One, because I knew the Nieman itself was going to be a great experience. But I also had the secret plan that I didn't share with anyone, which was that I would use the time off from work to look at the manuscript again. And while I was in Boston, I just had this chance meeting with an agent who approached me and asked, "Are you working on anything?" And I looked at her like, "Who are you? Like, did you drop out of the sky or something? Are you an angel?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I am." And she asked to see it. And next thing I knew, not only did I have an agent, I had a publisher. And that's when, by the time I came back to Ohio, I owed my newspaper at least a year. I had promised them that, so I kept my promise. And by the time I came back, I had a book contract. So that's how it happened.
And which book was that?
That was a book called Bombay Time, which I think only 7 people in the world have read, 5 of whom are in my family. So yeah.
I did not read that either.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write Honor?
So Honor had a very interesting beginning. Somewhere in like 2015, 2016, the New York Times did a series of articles about small town India, rural India. And some of the stories specifically were about the conditions of women in small town India. One story in particular about this small group of women who decide to seek employment outside their home and thereby incur the wrath of the village elders. It really captured my attention and interest. And while I was reading it, they were written by this fabulous reporter by the name of Ellen Berry, who at that time was the South Asian bureau chief for the Times. While I was reading this, I thought, man, this would make a great movie. Like somebody should really do something with this. I certainly wasn't thinking of it in terms of, oh, this is going to be my next project. But time went by and I found myself thinking back to that story and specifically thinking about those women, wondering what had happened to them and worrying about them a little bit. And being awed by the kind of defiance and courage that they had showed. And, you know, this is how I measure what to devote at least a year of my life to, is if it's a storyline that keeps haunting me, you know, that's how I know, yeah, this is going to work. This is something that is going to keep me interested in the months to come. And that was how Honor began.
So how did you do your research? You said you read this article. Did you go to India to do your research? Did you go to these small villages to see what it was like?
Yeah. So what I did was initially I just looked things up on Google, believe it or not. You know, I looked at photographs of like layouts of Indian villages, that because, you know, even though I grew up there, one, I've been away for a long, long time. And I was a city kid. You know, I grew up in Bombay, one of the largest cities in India. So I didn't know all that much about rural life in India. So I read a lot. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of articles. I talked to people. I interviewed attorneys over there who knew the criminal justice system, you know, how the police worked, how the court system worked. I did all of that, and I wrote a pretty good couple of drafts just based on the research that I'd done, basically sitting at my desk. And then I did make a trip there to just sort of make sure that what I was saying actually matched with the reality on the ground.
So you talk about these women, the horrific punishments that they were doled out for not listening to the rules of the men. Can you talk a little about the religious violence and the history of it in these villages?
Yeah. So, you know, it depends a little bit on whom you ask, right? There are some historians and researchers and academics who will tell you that Hindus and Muslims lived in relative peace for hundreds of years, and that it was British colonialism with the classic divide and rule policies that really started creating these religious differences between groups of people who had lived, we're talking about the villages. I mean, there were people who lived side by side for hundreds of years, for numerous generations with no problems, and that this was a political situation that was created by people who, benefited from it. And I'm sorry to say that if indeed we believe the school of thought that these problems really sort of got into the bloodstream of India, so to speak, the body politic, because of British colonialism, I'm sorry to say that that tradition, that dishonorable tradition, has been continued by India's leaders today. If they are not pointing fingers at the Muslim minority in India and playing people against each other, they're pointing fingers at Pakistan, which is a predominantly, it's a Muslim country, And now, of course, there's a Hindu nationalist right-wing government that is in power. And they are openly going around saying that just like Pakistan is a Muslim state, India is and ought to be a Hindu state. The founders of modern India, people like Gandhi, people like the first Prime Minister, Nehru, who was a contemporary of Gandhi, they were resolutely secular in their thinking. And the Constitution of India describes itself as a secular democracy. But this is really coming in for a lot of, they're targeting the Constitution itself. And there's now this very revisionist school of thought that says people like Gandhi, people like Nehru were traitors to the cause, that they basically sold people a bill of goods, and that from the very get-go, it should have been a predominantly Hindu country. So for instance, I am neither Hindu nor Muslim. I grew up as something known as a Zoroastrian or a Parsi, as they're known in India. My ancestors came from what used to be Persia, and have really thrived in India, have done very well for themselves, and have had no problems really. We haven't been targeted in any way, any of that. But basically, it remains to be seen that if the Constitution is altered, or even just in practice, if you start believing that this is a Hindu state, what does that do to all the minorities, the Christians, the Parsis, the Muslims, the Buddhists, all the minorities that have always been part of this thriving network in India?
So when you grew up in Bombay, did you have any idea what went on in these villages, like with the honor killings and stuff? And do they still exist today? Is this going on today?
By the time I was a teenager, I was pretty politically aware, I would say perhaps more so than most of my contemporaries. And yeah, occasionally you would read in the newspapers about an attack on a certain group of people, and we certainly were aware of the mistreatment of women. But I have to say that all those years later, when I read these articles in the Times by Ellen Berry, I was shocked. I was shocked because to me, the transgressions were so ordinary. They were so commonplace. Like, I didn't think there was a part of the country today that would have prohibitions against women going to work outside the home. That blew my mind. And then what really blew my mind was the backlash and the punishments that were meted out against these women. They were being ostracized. Nobody in the villages would talk to them. I mean, that all really took my breath away, and it made me feel ashamed.
Yeah, it was hard to read. I mean, it was an excellent book, but I found it very difficult to read at times. So there were two, before we get into the book a little, how do you write? Do you take notes? Do you have an outline? How many hours a day do you spend writing? How long does it take you to write the book?
Yeah. So I don't outline on paper, but what I do when I'm serious about tackling my next book is I think about it all the time. I write dialogue in the shower. I write entire chapters in the shower in my head. Every time I go for a walk, every time I wash the dish. If I go to a play or a movie, I'm sort of half watching the play or movie. What I'm really doing is just developing the next chapter of a book. So I pretty much outline the whole story in my head pretty early on. In terms of your second question about how many hours I write, this would have been an easier question to answer when I first started out. Because remember, I wrote my first novel during the Nieman year. And that kept me, the activities of the Nieman Fellowship itself kept me pretty busy, attending classes, etc. So the only time I had to myself during that year was to wake up very, very early in the morning, write for however long I could. If I didn't have class that day, I might write from 5 in the morning till 4 in the evening, But if I had to get dressed and, be at school, I might write for 3 hours. And that discipline of waking up early in the morning while the mind is fresh and writing sustained me through the first several of my novels. And then it became a kind of free for all. As you get older, life just gets busier. My day job as a professor is pretty demanding. And, time gets fragmented in some ways. So now, I guess the honest answer would be, I write when I can, for as long as I can, as well as I can, and there might be days when I can't get to the computer at all. And I just forgive myself for that. I don't crack the whip. There was a time when I was a younger writer when I might have done that, but I just know that if I'm interested in the project, it will get done,
And how long did it take you to write, Honor? How many?
Oh, I think I might have finished the first draft in maybe 6 to 7 months. But then there was a lot of writing and rewriting. My editor wanted some changes in the first few chapters of the book. She wanted the starting point of the book not to be with Smita arriving in India, but she wanted a little bit about her life in Brooklyn before we got into that. I wasn't sure, so I didn't fight it. I just made those changes. After I made those changes and gave that version to her, she decided, no, that didn't work. So we went back to Smita stepping into Bombay. So there was a lot of back and forth, perhaps more than any of my other books. I really worked closely with my editor and took her suggestions to heart with this book.
So there was 2 love stories going on in the book, Meena and Abdul and Smita and Mohan. So did you write the stories separately, or did you write them in order, or just you write as they come to your head when you're sitting on the
No,
bus?
I pretty much, in this particular case, I pretty much wrote them in chronological order. I do remember that in one of the earlier versions, I introduced Meena a lot sooner into the book. I didn't wait for Smita to go to the village and meet Meena, so it might have been chapter 2, it might have been chapter 3, but that voice, that first person voice comes in a lot sooner. And then when I was reorganizing the manuscript, I thought it made more sense to just have book 1, I think it's book 1, be Smita's arrival in India, the meetup with Mohan, and then, the journey into the heart of the country. And then all of a sudden we have this voice, and at first we're confused because we don't know who is speaking to us. And then that's how we are introduced to Meena. But I pretty much wrote it in chronological order.
So Smita meets Meena, and I felt like Smita was privileged. You know, she was an Indian born in America, and she was very privileged. And then she meets Meena and sees how her life is. So do you think, I got a sense that Smita learned a lot from Meena in the book, where you would think it might have been opposite, that Meena would learn.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for picking up on that. That was precisely my intention. You know, I didn't want this to turn into a story, the predictable story of the rich woman sort of arriving as a savior and uplifting or lifting up the downtrodden woman. Because I feel like, even based on my observations of life in India, I think if middle-class people in India would just let themselves, they would learn a lot from those who serve them, you know, those who they might consider to be beneath them. So it was very important to me to flip the narrative, to flip the script, and not have it go down the usual predictable path, but instead have it be Smita, who, for all her privileges, is broken. I mean, she's a broken, very brittle human being, you know, very closed, very tight. And it's the combination of Mohan and Meena, Meena just acting as a kind of inspiration, just her heroism, her courage, her willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of love, that acts as an inspiration, I think, ultimately for Smita.
So Smita, talk about Smita a little. She went back to her mother's neighborhood to look up her mom's friend. And she was surprised how she's received. So something happened in Smita's family's past, but you don't talk about that until later in the story. What made you do that?
Oh, I mean, it's just one of those techniques of writing, I think. You know, you don't give away a surprise. I mean, as a reader, I love books that have a bit of a twist and that have a bit of a reveal later on, you know. So I guess I was trying to do something similar. I mean, we clearly hint at the fact that all is not right, that Smita's family, you know, did not leave India for America because of educational opportunities or financial opportunities. They were very comfortable in India, that something had happened that had driven them out, but I didn't want to give away what that was. So it's just a little plot device, I guess.
Yeah, it was good.
Thank you.
So Smita said in the book, it's a privilege to tell other people's stories. And Mohan said to her, but who do you tell your story to? So why do you think it's important for people to tell other people's story as well as their own?
Because I think if all you're doing is tell other people's stories, that still leaves you in a position of power. You know, the storyteller always has the power. And I think I was just talking to a friend of mine about this earlier today, believe it or not, that one of the ways to build friendship, one of the ways to build community, one of the ways we get to know each other is by being vulnerable. And it's through the act of storytelling, it's through the act of, this has happened to me, and this is how I'm recovering from whatever has happened to me, good, bad. That's how we get to know one another, you know? So if all you're doing is telling other people's stories, that still keeps you as the person behind the screen, you know? But it's only when you rip that mask off your own face that somebody else gets to see you as being fully human.
Right.
Right.
That could be very, very vulnerable for people, but true.
Right, exactly.
So can we talk about Meena a little? I think she never really found her voice in the story. She was always oppressed and worked in this village. does this still go on today, that these women are in the house and they're not given any voices?
Well, you figure, Ellen Berry's not a fiction writer. She's a journalist. She's a reporter. So she's telling true stories. And it's not like I found a newspaper clipping from 100 years ago, or even 50 or 20 years ago. I mean, these stories ran, you can easily Google them in 2015 or 2016 or somewhere around there. So clearly these things still go on today. Yeah. I mean, not, again, please, I'm always a little nervous about doing these kinds of talks because, for one thing, I'm just telling a specific story. I'm not telling the story of a billion people. India is a wildly diverse country. Every region is different. There are 21 official languages and recognized by the Indian Constitution. There's probably 7,000 dialects. So there's no one central story that describes all of India. I mean, I can take you to parts of India that you would think you were in Midtown. It's a very diverse. So I'm telling a specific story about a certain group of people, a certain village in India where these things happen. And are there places like that? Absolutely.
And still goes on today, probably.
Yeah, for sure.
There and here, similar stories. So Smita has a love-hate relationship with India, and she seems to struggle with this throughout the book. She and Mohan see the country very differently. How do you think the United States and India are similar or different from what they see it as?
I think many of us here are very much like Mohan. Mohan, we are told, grows up believing India is the greatest country on earth, right? That's a narrative I think we certainly have in this country. I mean, how many times have we said, USA, greatest country on earth? And is it true? In many ways, I think so. I mean, as an immigrant who built a very happy and good life for myself in this country and owe a great deal to this country, it's very easy for me to say, yes, greatest country in the world, and to subscribe to that narrative. But when you look at other measures, I don't think you can ever judge a country by how, people who have a certain degree of affluence or education, people like everybody here today, I don't think you judge countries by how all of us are doing. You judge countries by how the poorest of the poor are doing, right? And by that measure, we fail. We fail miserably. I was talking to a friend of mine from India, and she said, she's been here many times. She said, I love the US. I love everything about it. She said, but the problem that you all have with guns, she said, my God, I cannot fathom it. I cannot get my mind around that you're willing to sacrifice school children. She is a recent grandmother, so this is something that's very close to her heart. She said, what? Try and make sense of it to me. And I said, I can't. I mean, it makes no sense to me either, And I said, all I can tell you is it doesn't make sense to fully 50% of the country. So please don't, paint all of us with such a broad stroke, right? So I think this is just, every nation does this, every nation thinks they are the best. I just find it so endearing and so funny about human beings that, whatever religion you're born into is the best. Whatever nation you're born into is the best. Whatever race you're born into is the best. It's our egos, it's that tribal thing that we all have, and that's universal, I find.
But on your website, you wrote something very interesting. You said the novel poses the question of whether it is possible to love a country when you're ashamed of its politics and practices. What form and shape does that love take? So what you talk about gun control, what's going on with women's issues in this country right now, I think that's a very real thing that should be talked about and addressed. And I wonder if people are ashamed of its politics and practices because of this all
In India?
in US.
Oh, in the US. Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, love is love, right? Love is not always rational. I mean, I have to confess to you and tell you, every time I hear um, the Star Spangled Banner, I get goosebumps. This is not something that I do. My body does this, right? And I get a lump in my throat. But does that mean that I will not be critical of the issues that you talked about? You know, what's happening with women's rights, what's happening, you know, just what we are seeing, the banning of books in schools. Those are alarming trends. And we have seen this movie before in the 1930s and 1940s, right? So we cannot even proclaim innocence anymore, right? We know the path where all this leads to. We don't have that luxury of innocence, of being blindsided anymore. So of course we have an obligation to speak out, but to me, that is the very essence of love, is not acceptance, but protest, you know, to speak out when you see things that you feel like are really harming the fundamentals of what makes a country great.
You know, it's funny, but when I'm reading Honor, I get the sense that you're not changing people's minds. You know, those brothers' minds weren't being changed no matter what they were reasoned with and what they, you know, I mean, they were one of the hardest parts of the book to read. You know, when they spit on the ground to talk, when they were talking about Meena, they said their sister was dead to them. Those minds were never being changed, how they
Yeah,
felt.
I don't think so, unless they can be changed long term with education. I mean, you have to also understand that the characters in this book, you know, the characters around Meena are dirt poor, and they are basically illiterate, right? They have not been exposed to, excuse me, any of the things that we take for granted. They have never stepped foot inside a public library. You know, they have never stepped foot, most of them, inside a school. So, you know, I think ultimately it comes down to education, maybe. I mean, we see people in this country who have gone to Harvard and Yale and still, you know, have not truly benefited from what an education in the humanities can give them. So I'm not saying that it's an answer for everything, but surely it could not hurt.
Right. So so their brothers. So Meena was I felt was caught in the middle too, because her brothers felt one way, and then if they were found guilty by the judges, I was wondering that how she could go back and live in her community if they went against her brothers. You know, the judges found her not, you know, innocent. Does that make any sense?
I just, no, I didn't get it.
I
Sorry.
think Meena worried that if her brothers were found guilty, the other people
Right.
will take
Yeah,
consequences on her
she's
for her
she's
behavior too, like she
exactly.
can do no right.
She's damned if she does and
And
damned
she's
if she
damned if she
doesn't. Yeah.
doesn't. Like there's
She
no,
just, she's just in a very, very precarious place. You know, there's no winning for her. And that is also part of what makes her so brave. Not just that she defies all of society and marries Abdul, you know, somebody who is outside of her religion. Uh, but the fact that she agrees to take her brothers to court, I mean, that is virtually unheard of. And I think it's that level of courage and valor that ultimately impresses Smita.
right. And it's sad because she basically can't win either way.
Yeah.
So Smita looks Indian, but was born in America. And her personality tells people that she was not from India, you know, when she starts talking. When you go back to India, do you encounter this, that, you know?
Yeah, actually I do, very much so. This incident that I'm about to tell you actually happened well over 20 years ago. Um, I was taking a evening stroll with my best friend in India, who still lives there, um, at the seaside one evening. We had just gone to the seaside. And, in those days, for some reason, you don't see too many beggars and street urchins on the streets today. Or if you do, significantly less numbers. But in those days, you couldn't just go for a walk as a middle class person and not be surrounded by, basically kids begging for money. And what my friend noticed was they were not asking her for money. They were all asking me for money. And I was oblivious to it. I was just so busy talking to her, that I wasn't really paying attention. And she said, "Look at what's happening." And I said, well, yeah, this doesn't make sense. What explains it? And she said, "You act different and you look different to them." And I mean, these were kids as young as 4 years old, right? I said, "What do you mean? I mean, we could almost be sisters. We look alike, And she said, "No, it's the cut of your clothes. It's everything. Just the way you carry yourself is different." And they, at this young age, can pick up on that, which I thought was amazing. And of course, my tortured Hindi, which I don't really speak well at all, I never did, and now it's even worse, and it's probably a little accented too now. That is a dead giveaway. Like if I go into a store, they have my number, by the time I walk in. So yeah, it's interesting how that happens.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess that's for a lot of people when they go to a foreign country, though, too,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Meena's mother-in-law, Ami, can you talk about her? How did that character come to you, and was she difficult to write?
It's funny when I do these talks, readers really hate Ami. This is Meena's sister, mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law. She was so mean to her.
She's so mean to her. And what I always ask readers to do is to just allow themselves to feel a little bit of compassion for Ami. I mean, Ami is a traumatized woman, if you think about it. She has lost not only Abdul, her oldest son, but also her other son, who, after the events that happened, runs away from home, right? She has lost both kids. She is now saddled, in her way of looking at it, with a severely disfigured daughter-in-law who cannot find employment, cannot earn her own keep, and therefore is yet another mouth to feed for Ami, who is not a young person. So she lashes out at Meena constantly because Meena is there. There's nobody. All her friends have abandoned her for fear of, Ami's bad luck rubbing off on them. She is almost as isolated now as Meena herself is. And yes, in a perfect world, they would each recognize the other person's loss and wounds and try and heal them. But human nature being what it is, what drives Ami, they always say that if you scratch the surface of anger, you find grief. I don't know that Ami has ever dealt with her grief of losing both kids. So it just comes out constantly as meanness and anger. So she wasn't a hard character to write. I felt like I understood her motivations well enough that I got her. I didn't like her, but I got her.
Right. I guess you could feel a little sympathy.
Yeah.
So the honor, was this your title's first choice?
Yes.
How did you come up with it? It was.
Yeah. And that doesn't always happen. There have been many, many books where I've had to change the title for one reason or the other. But yeah, it was always honor from the first draft. And I just think it's the right title for this book because there are many, many instances of dishonor. I was also thinking of honor killings. But what also struck me was, even Meena's brothers, who are the most dishonorable characters in the book, they don't think of themselves as dishonorable people. They think of themselves as truly honorable men, that she's the one, by marrying outside the faith, who has dishonored and brought shame and dishonor onto the family and onto the larger village, right? And I find that so fascinating that they can really justify the unthinkable, because they are so rooted in their beliefs, right? So the title it's a little bit ironic, but I also wanted to sort of pay tribute with the title to people like Meena, like her husband Abdul, to somebody like Mohan, who's a very honorable person, that, we all have a tendency to focus on the ills of the world. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of sad and hard truths in this novel, but we should also celebrate, those beacons of light who seem to flourish in every society, in every period of history. I mean, look at the Holocaust. It's a great example of how, yeah, a lot of people colluded, but some people resisted, So, and those are people like Meena and Abdul.
I also read that Abru, Mina's child, means honor. So were you honoring this child? Is that what your intention was?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So the cover of the book, there are 2 mangoes on it.
Yeah.
How did you, how did you come up with that?
I didn't. That was purely a decision of the art department. And at first, I have to confess that when I first looked at it, I was a little confused. I didn't quite know what to make of that. So I actually asked my editor, and she reminded me, see, there'd been so many years almost since I had turned in the book to her and, finally got to see the jacket of the book, that I had forgotten that small, but in her mind, pivotal scene during Meena and Abdul's courtship, when he offers her 2 mangoes that his brother had brought back from a trip. And that's sort of the beginning of this very timid, very tenuous kind of courtship. And she said it was the art department or whoever, the designer, the book's designers, they picked out that, and that's the jacket. And once I understood that, I really, really like the jacket a lot.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
So you, how did you feel when you found out that Reese Witherspoon picked your book? And did it impact your writing or your book sales or anything? That must have been an exciting time.
Yeah, I was stunned. I just had no idea that till today, to be honest with you, Carol, I don't know how the book came to her attention. I don't know. I should ask. I keep intending to ask my editor, but I haven't yet. And it's been a year since it's been out. But they called me, my editor called me on my birthday. She actually texted me and said, "Can you get on a Zoom call right now?" And I thought, oh no, she's leaving and she wants to tell me she's leaving. And I didn't want to get any bad news on my birthday. So I said, "Can we do this on Monday?" And she said, actually, no, I'm not really asking, I'm telling you to get on Zoom. So I was like, okay, bracing myself for the worst. And then next thing I see is there's like about 6 people beaming on the Zoom call. And they were the whole team, the marketing people, the publicity people, all of them. And some of whom I was seeing for the first time on Zoom, because this was during the pandemic still. And they told me, and then the toughest part was, I found out in September, and I couldn't breathe a word of it to anybody until the big reveal, the day the book came out, in January. So it was hard to sit on this for that long, but, managed to do it.
It must make your book sales soar when this happened.
I think it couldn't have hurt, that's for sure. I think what it did was it introduced the book to an audience that otherwise might not have been interested in a book with so serious a subject matter, because like it or not, like most of my books are about pretty serious issues, you know. I write a lot about notions of power, you know, and like power differentials between men and women, between races, between groups of people, nations, you know, that kind of stuff. So it's not easy reading for everybody. And I think having Reese saying to her readers, you know, read this book, definitely introduce the book to a new audience that I otherwise would not have been able to reach.
Right. I follow her books. I read the books she recommends.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm
she's
sure a
good.
lot of people do. Yeah, she's good.
Yeah.
So have you received any negative feedback from Hindu or Muslim people from the book? How
A
did they?
little bit, a little bit. Not anything overwhelming, not even worth really talking about, but there've been occasional. I remember this one very funny email I got, which said something to the effect of, who funded the writing of this book? Was it Pakistan? You know, and I almost felt like writing back and saying, how I wish it was. I would have been a lot richer than I am if a whole state, a whole country, you know, just silly things like that. And then people saying, you know, you're portraying India in a bad light, you know, as primarily before a Western audience. You know, why don't you write about all the achievements? Why do you focus? But that's a narrative that many middle class Indians feel about the West in general, you know, Western media in general, that we tend to focus on what's wrong with the country as opposed to the many things that are right. And it's just a defensive crouch. Part of me understands it, but I'm also of the belief, you know, if you don't like something, change the reality, don't kill the messenger, you know.
That's true.
Yeah.
So you said before we went on this that you have another book coming out. You want to talk about that?
Sure, just a little bit. It's coming out in September. It's called The Museum of Failures. And it's a book that's mostly set in India. It's the story of this young man in his 30s who goes to India for a visit. And while he's there, he realizes that his mom is pretty ill. And while he's also there, he stumbles upon a family secret that basically we find out that mother and son have never had, bless you, have never had a good relationship. They've always had a very fraught relationship. And once he discovers what this secret is, it forces him to reevaluate, you know, his whole childhood, his whole life, but also his relationship with his mom. So it's very different than Honor. It's not a political book in any sense. It's a domestic drama. It's a family story. It's smaller in scope in some ways, but I hope it resonates with readers.
And when is this going to be published?
September.
This 23.
Yeah, 23.
I
Yeah.
look forward to reading that.
Thank you.
So is Honor going to become a movie? Has there been any talk about Honor becoming a
No,
movie?
not yet. Not yet. I hope, but not yet.
I think it would make a great movie.
Thank you. Maybe we should pass a hat collection around.
So there's 28 questions in the chat room that I
Oh.
haven't looked at. So let me see if I could get to some of them because I
Sure.
think we're running out a little bit of time here.
I'm looking at one right now, and it's a great question. I haven't been asked this before, so I'm going to tackle it. It's from Sherry Lipson, and it says, when did the decision to name the child Abru occur in the process? And Sherry, it actually occurred pretty late. I had a different name for Abru. Please don't ask me what it was because I've already forgotten. And then when I was writing that very short final chapter, it occurred to me that that I should change the name. I don't want to give it away to those who have not read the book, but for reasons that become obvious when you read that last chapter, almost like a prologue, not a prologue, epilogue. it was at that stage that I thought, yeah, I should change the name of the child to reflect, the book. And that's when I did that.
Charlotte Hollander wrote, was the story honor based on knowing anyone personally who struggled with the same issues that the characters in your book faced?
No, not the character of Smita, not the character of Meena. Like I said, the origins came from a newspaper article.
Annette Costa said, what was the subject of your dissertation?
I did something on, I think, 4 African-American women writers, 20th century women writers, and their depictions of magic and the supernatural.
Linda Gass wrote, what I love about your books is that you make us think about how people treat each other and the intricacies of their relationships and all the ways people are complicated and complicitly connected. That's why your books always come alive for me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Do you have, and then she said, do you have a favorite among your books?
The Space Between Us was a book that I've often said was the book that I was born to write, because that book talks about the situation with domestic servants in India and the relationship between, those mostly women who work in your middle-class home, and the relationship between, quote unquote, the mistress of the household and these servants. And this was a phenomenon that I used to observe as a child, and again, the taboos against, you could clean the furniture, you could dust it, but you couldn't sit on it, you couldn't share, you couldn't break bread with the people that you work for. Even as a child, I hated that. It just didn't sit right with me. And so that was a book that I was just bursting at the seams to write. So that will always, and the book also did very well for me. And I think that's the book early in my career that really has made all the other books possible, because, publishing is a tough business. And I can't tell you how many writers have a book or two and then you don't ever hear from them again because they can't get a new contract, And so you're always holding your breath when you write a book, because you just don't know what the future holds,
And I have to say, that was the first book I read of yours. And then I go back, a lot of times I go back and read an author and I don't like the second or third books. In your books, it's one after another that's better than the next. So
thank you so much.
Bravo to you.
I wrote a sequel to The Space Between Us called The Secrets Between Us that just came out about 3-4 years ago. And I had sworn up and down that I would never write a sequel. But it was just one of those things where a new character presented herself to me in a flash. And I started writing that book that afternoon. I was so excited to tell the story and take it in a different direction. I think when readers ask for a sequel, very often they sort of want the same story twice. And I didn't want to do that,
So Marcy Stecker asked, she read Everyone's Son, which is another great book.
Everybody's Son.
Everybody's Son, which was a departure for you thematically. She asked, what inspired you to write this book? Was it to make statements about race relationships? Although the son of African American, the situation described can be expanded to any race.
The latter part of the question, yes, I think so. And what inspired me to write that book? That was the origin point of that book, was something that will probably never happen to me again in the course of my career. This is the God honest truth. I was in the shower, was minding my own business, thinking of God knows what, wasn't thinking about books, wasn't thinking about, what'll my next book be about? And this entire story, from start to finish, from first line to last line, with the names of the characters attached, came to me in the span of 30 seconds. It was like watching a movie. I knew the whole book So what choice do you have when something like that happens? You have to write the darn thing, you know?
So Rena E asked, do you know the ending of your stories before you begin them?
I often do, which is not to say that the ending doesn't change. It can change, it does change. But see, I have friends who are writers who literally know the first line of a book and nothing else. And then they write the second line, and then they write the third line. I'm too much of a coward to do that. If I'm going to devote a year of my life to a project, I truly want to know that I'm not going to run out of juice by page 200, you know? So, and it's just the way my brain is wired also. When I'm thinking of my characters, when I'm thinking of what they're doing, where they're doing it, it just automatically skips ahead to the point where I know the ending. When I wrote The Space Between Us, I knew the first line of the book and I knew the last line, nothing in between. But I felt like my job was easy. All I had to do was like take these two ends of a string and knot them up together and I have a book, you know? So every book is a little different, you know?
So Karen wrote, no men in your book oppose the honor killings except Mohan. Is that truly representative of men's viewpoints today?
You know, I don't think so. I don't think that's, I mean, I personally know every man that I personally know who lives in India would be absolutely opposed to honor killings. It's just that there aren't that many other men in the book, you know, as far as I can tell, there are the brothers, there's Mohan, and there's that village head who's a complete, you know, corrupt fool. But somebody like Smita's father, who of course is not, but you know that somebody like him would be strongly opposed to something like that. So it just so happens that there are a limited number of characters in the book. So Mohan sort of stands out as the person who is opposed to it.
So Diane Sina wrote, you are truly an inspiration to us. You mentioned that you get goosebumps when you listen to the Star Spangled Banner. And I have to say that I have goosebumps listening to you. Thank you for your brilliant writing. And I hope your students realize how fortunate they are to have you as their professor. I look forward to your next book. We all agree.
They don't. I just taught class yesterday and I came home and I said, man, it's like pulling teeth sometimes, you know, but the weather is crappy outside right now and everybody's already, it's not even February and everybody's kind of blah over here anyway. How are you guys doing? How's the weather in New York?
It's been pretty nice here. It's going to get
That's
cold
great.
now, but it's been pretty warm for
That's
January.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We haven't had a whole lot of snow, but it's just a little blah.
Yeah, we haven't had snow either. We had a couple of flurries today, but no snow.
Yeah.
That's okay. I don't like to shovel so much. How are your books received in India? Dina Harris wants to know.
You know, I don't have a huge readership in India. There is clearly a literary community in India, but from what I understand, and maybe it's because people there have been spoiled by sort of the magical fantasies of Bollywood, but the books that sell well in India are like thrillers and romance and that kind of genre fiction, you know. So
You sell all over the world. Do you find that in some countries it works better than?
yeah, like Brazil, for instance. My books do really, really well in Brazil. Go figure. I mean, I was A Space Between Us was probably a bigger hit in Brazil than it was even in the US. And at first I was really stunned. You know, I thought, Brazil, why Brazil? Well, Brazil is it's a society also very much divided by class differences. So I think the issues that I wrote about in that book resonated with a lot of middle class readers there, you know. And in those days, there was this fascination there with all things Indian. So that didn't hurt either.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Michelle Drago asked, maybe ask why you chose the ending you chose. Did you have an alternate?
I didn't really. And in fact, at first, the book just ends with the airport scene. But that last page and a half, I think, ended up being absolutely necessary to the book. And I knew it was necessary because when I wrote it, it moved me to tears, that ending. And I figured if it moves me to tears, then that's a good sign, you know.
So Lori Overman asked, are any of your classes available to audit online?
What's available?
Are any of your classes available to?
No, sadly, no, we are back to teaching in person, and that's all we're doing right now. But thank you so much for asking. And somebody else had asked where I teach. It's called Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. Let's take the last question about role of Anjali.
Yeah, I was
the
just going to ask
attorney.
that. Go ahead. The attorney
Yeah.
and relationship with her assistant.
Yeah, so, that's the other question that keeps coming up. A lot of readers seem to think that Anjali is sort of a dubious character, that she basically uses Meena to serve her own ends. And I don't see her that way at all. I see her as this very earnest, she's a do-gooder, she's an activist. She wants to change these rules, and she wants to change the system. And so she has to do what she does when she gets a client like Meena, regardless of whether win or lose, it's an attack on the system. So every time somebody like Meena sues, say, her brothers, it's a step in the right direction. That's how Anjali sees it. So it's not a question of whether Meena is a pawn in her game. That's certainly not her. And she's every bit as shocked and dismayed, by the results of the court case as Meena herself is.
Well, I'm getting a lot of thank yous, and thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And Carol, may I say, you've asked some great questions. I mean, you're really good at this, obviously.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have any comments, or you want to unmute yourself? Or
Well, let's just give Carol a hand.
you too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yay. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
All right.
Thank you.
Everybody
And I hope
go
you
have
come
your-
for your, I hope you come for your next book and talk about the next
If
book.
you invite me, I promise you.
Oh, I will.
All right.
Thank you so much.
It'll give
Yes.
us all something to look forward to. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
So much.
Thank you for taking time on a Tuesday to attend. I really
It was
appreciate
wonderful. It was
each one
wonderful.
of you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
for taking the
Bye-bye.
time.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm a graduate of Case Western Reserve. Yay.
All right. All right. Cleveland connection.
That
Wonderful.
was funny.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank you, Carol.
Bye.
This is wonderful.
Than's everybody.
thank you.
Next book, what date did you say the next book would be? And which?
It's The Violent Conspiracy.
Oh,
I-
loved it.
Yes.
Did you read it?
Loved it.
Yeah, I'm reading it now.
Oh,
I
it's
love,
wonderful.
I love that book.
Me
Very
too.
anxious to hear
Wonderful.
him speak.
Thank you,
Okay.
Carol. I'm going to stop recording now, okay?
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah.